Recently, there was a mobilization of reservists in Belarus. Even though there was no training, the reservists were called up, their cell phones were confiscated, and they were notified to report within a few hours. Because of this, quite a few people are expressing their anxiety on social media. Today, let's take a closer look at this situation. Let's get right into it. Before we begin, I want to mention that I've published a book this time. It's my very first merchandise, and I would really appreciate it if you could just take a look at it. From mid-February 2026, residents in the western region of Belarus suddenly received reserve force mobilization orders. As a result, they were notified to report for military duty without prior notice and were ordered to respond to the mobilization within a few hours. Social media posts say that after receiving the reserve mobilization order, they went to the training center that same day. Pavel Latushko, who is also a Belarusian opposition figure, said in an interview with Ukrainian broadcaster Kiev24 that the speed and method of this reserve force mobilization in Belarus seemed different from previous reserve training. Pavel Latushko also said that the notification arrived at 10 p.m. and they had to report to the reserve training center by 8 a.m. the next morning. He added that large-scale mobilizations are taking place in various parts of western Belarus. He also said that since cell phones are confiscated when entering the reserve training center, there is no way to contact family once inside. Most importantly, there is currently no reserve training in Belarus. Suddenly calling up the reserves without scheduled training is very significant. The Belarusian government says the reserve call-up is a sudden readiness check. Officials claim it's a routine measure to assess combat readiness. However, the circumstances reported locally are very unusual. The call-up notice was delivered in a very short period of time, and there are even testimonies that some of those called up were required to report immediately. Reports say movement orders were issued without detailed explanations, sparking speculation that this may not be just a one-time exercise. So some are interpreting this measure as a preliminary step in preparation for a possible mobilization order in the future. It's seen as a test of readiness by running administrative and mobilization systems as if in a real scenario. Analysts note the timing is especially sensitive. This mobilization started as NATO members Poland and Lithuania boosted border security. Both nations recently deployed more troops and expanded surveillance, increasing tensions. In this situation, as reservists are being mobilized mainly in the western region of Belarus, neighboring countries are interpreting this as a military signal. Troop movements near border areas are bound to trigger immediate countermeasures. The overlap in timing and location makes this measure a potential factor affecting regional security, beyond just an internal inspection. Depending on whether additional mobilization measures follow, or if it ends as a one-time inspection, the direction of tensions in Eastern Europe could change significantly. Some are interpreting this move in connection with Russia's manpower shortage issue. Russia has faced heavy troop losses during the brief war, and has consistently struggled to replenish its forces. In this situation, there is speculation that Russia may be trying to utilize the forces of Belarus, which is militarily closely connected, rather than directly declaring an additional mobilization. However, NATO's assessment is relatively cautious. NATO currently believes that it is unlikely that the Belarusian military will immediately launch a full-scale attack on Ukraine, considering internal public opinion in Belarus, the combat readiness of the military, and the political burden they would have to bear if they directly participate in the war. NATO judges that a hasty escalation is not easy. Nevertheless, NATO emphasizes the need for continued vigilance, because it would not take much time for troop movements or deployments under the pretext of training to turn into actual operations. In particular, the mobilization of reservists in western Belarus is adjacent to geographically sensitive areas. If troops are deployed here, it could send warning signals not only to northern Ukraine, but also to NATO's eastern front, including Poland and Lithuania. That's why NATO is boosting intelligence and surveillance, closely monitoring the situation. It's difficult to say an invasion is imminent, but with Russia facing manpower shortages and keeping its options open, Belarus's recent actions are seen as a significant variable. In fact, Russia is suffering from chronic manpower shortages. Ukraine is also facing severe manpower shortages, but Russia looks very exhausted from the prolonged war. Right now, Russia has been fighting this war even longer than the Eastern Front during World War II. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, reports Russia has had 1.2 million casualties in 4 years of fighting in Ukraine, while the UK Ministry of Defense estimates Russian military casualties have surpassed 1 million. This is the greatest loss suffered by a major power in any war since World War II. Above all, the human casualties are just too devastating. The economy and industry are suffering directly. They're currently staying afloat with the defense industry, but once the war ends, the full damage will show. Because of this, Russia is desperately trying to solve its manpower shortage. Some are saying that Belarus could be used as a resource in this situation. Above all, Russia recently decided to block Telegram. They have also tightened restrictions on access to certain social media platforms and messaging services. The prevailing opinion is that this is a measure to prevent the spread of protests in the event of a mobilization order. President Putin signed a decree to conscript Russian reservists in December 2025, requiring them to attend mandatory military training camps in 2026 for the Russian military, National Guard, Federal Security Service, Ministry of Emergency Situations, military rescue teams, and other security agencies. The U.S. Institute for the Study of War analyzed that this decree is intended to allow the conscription of reservists. Of course, it seems that it will be quite difficult for Russia to declare a mobilization order recklessly, even though Russia is suffering from a manpower shortage. President Vladimir Putin has already experienced once what happens when he declares a full-scale mobilization order. When the partial mobilization order was announced in 2022, hundreds of thousands of Russian men crossed into countries like Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Finland. Airfare soared, and long lines of vehicles formed at border checkpoints. This scene revealed the intense anxiety among those facing conscription, regardless of public war support. As the war continues, economic strain, casualties, and family anxiety grow, making renewed social unrest likely if another major mobilization occurs. The Russian government knows this. Recently, instead of full mobilization, they've used indirect methods like expanding contract soldiers, offering big bonuses, recruiting inmates, and attracting foreign mercenaries. However, this approach creates a heavy financial burden and may lower troop stability. Above all, as the war drags on, there tends to be a decrease in voluntary recruits. Is this where the Belarus card comes into play? So, as I explained earlier, that's why there is talk of using Belarus's reservists to fill the manpower gap. If this happens, Russia won't issue a new mobilization order, so a mass exodus is unlikely. Meanwhile, the international community may view it as an independent military action by Belarus. Another important point is the sharing of political responsibility. If Russia carries out additional mobilization directly, the burden falls squarely on Moscow. However, if Belarus calls up reservists and expands military activities, Russia can take a supporting role from the rear. This is a much more flexible strategy in terms of managing domestic public opinion. It may be a calculated move to maintain war capabilities while minimizing social backlash. There's no confirmation this is being implemented, but given Russia's manpower issues and domestic fatigue, there's reason to pursue an indirect approach over a large-scale mobilization. That's why the recent move by Belarus to call up reservists is being interpreted as a strategic option rather than just a simple training exercise. Also, Russia is recruiting mercenaries from various countries to solve its manpower shortage problem. Kenya is the biggest example. Russia lured more than 1,000 Kenyan men to participate in the war by promising high wages and citizenship to young Kenyans. The Kenyan National Intelligence Service announced that Russia recruited mainly former soldiers, police, and civilians aged mid-20s to 50s. When recruiting, they only said they'd work in Russia, but upon arrival, they were sent straight to the Ukrainian front. And it's not just Kenya. There are increasing cases where people from developing countries like Cuba, India, and Southeast Asia are being deceived and sent to the Ukrainian front in this way. They're luring poor young people from Southeast Asia and sending them to the front lines. They offer Southeast Asian youths a monthly salary of about $2,000 to $2,300 and promise Russian citizenship, so they accept and go to Russia. Of course, they are immediately sent to the Ukrainian front. According to media reports, the average survival time for new recruits on the front lines is only 72 hours, so they are literally being used as cannon fodder. Ukrainian authorities report over 18,000 people from 128 countries have served or are serving in the Russian military, which continues to recruit mercenaries worldwide. Anyway, it's still unclear what kind of signal Belarus is sending by suddenly calling up its reservists. With rumors that Russia may declare mobilization to address its manpower shortage and is recruiting widely, Belarus's sudden reservist call-up appears linked to the war in Ukraine.